They call it Red Onion State Prison, a place so silent it hums. Where the walls don't echo voices, they remember them. The prison that breathes fear. When the sun crawls over the Appalachian Mountains and touches the concrete ridges of Wise County, Virginia, its light never truly reaches Red Onion State Prison. The air up here is thin, crisp, and empty, as if nature itself refuses to breathe too close to the fences. From above, the facility looks surgical, gray blocks arranged like a target, razor wire glinting under the morning haze. Inside, it's another world, a world designed to erase noise, movement, and hope. Built in 1998 as Virginia's first super-maximum security facility, Red Onion was never meant to rehabilitate, it was engineered to control. Officials called it a prison within a prison. Every inmate here had already proven too violent, too unpredictable, or too connected to gangs to remain in any other facility. According to state records, most are locked inside single cells for 23 hours a day, the definition of solitary confinement. Back then, the U.S. was in the middle of its tough-on-crime era. Politicians promised safety. Taxpayers wanted distance from the people who scared them. And in the hills of Appalachia, local leaders saw an opportunity, a massive, fortress-style prison that would bring jobs to one of the poorest parts of Virginia. It worked, for a while. The jobs came. But so did something darker, a new ecosystem of control and resistance. Inside those walls, two forces took shape: the guards, sworn to maintain order at any cost, and the inmates, hardened men whose loyalty to gangs or survival instincts kept them alive. Red Onion didn't just cage criminals, it compressed them, concentrating anger, trauma, and fear until something had to give. The silent corridors. Walking into Red Onion isn't like entering a regular prison. There are no echoes of chatter, no clang of chains from crowded tiers. Just a low electric hum and the rhythmic buzz of fluorescent lights. Each pod is a mirror of the next, a perfect, symmetrical block of steel and concrete. Guards see through thick glass windows into rows of cells, each containing a metal bunk, a toilet, and a slot for food. There are no bars, only doors. Even the air feels monitored. Inmates call it the box farm. Guards call it the onion because every layer peels back pain. Among the first to arrive was a man we'll call Marcus H., composite name, drawn from court testimony records. He was sentenced for armed robbery and assault on a correctional officer at another facility. When he was transferred here in the early 2000s, his first words to a cellmate were reportedly, "So this is where they bury you alive." According to interviews later collected by human rights groups and the Virginia Department of Corrections reports, that statement wasn't far from truth. Inmates were kept inside cells the size of a parking space. 4 years. Exercise meant walking alone inside a concrete pen barely larger than a dog run. Communication between cells was through vents, tapping pipes, or flushing codes known only to those on the inside. To the administration, this was control. To the inmates, it was war through silence. Gangs behind the walls. Despite the isolation, gang activity never stopped. It evolved. According to a 2008 Virginia Corrections Gang Assessment Report, groups like the Aryan Brotherhood, the Gangster Disciples, the Bloods, and the Latin Kings all had documented members inside Red Onion. They used coded letters, smuggled notes, and even legal mail to communicate. Some prison officials later testified that gangs operated with a strange discipline, running what they called military units under lockdown. One former guard, quoted in a 2014 interview with the Richmond Times-Dispatch, said, "These guys don't need to see each other to move orders. They've built an invisible network inside our own system." That network would soon be tested by a tragedy that would make headlines nationwide. The death of Darrell Hall. On June 23, 2009, Darrell Hall, a 31-year-old inmate serving time for robbery, was involved in an altercation with correctional officers. According to official reports from the Virginia Department of Corrections and coverage by the Associated Press, Hall was restrained after reportedly refusing orders to submit to handcuffs. During the struggle, he was pepper sprayed and placed in restraints. Minutes later, he was unresponsive. Medical examiners would later rule his death as homicide by asphyxiation, specifically, positional asphyxia due to restraint. The officers involved were not criminally charged, but the incident sparked a wave of legal filings and media attention focused on use of force in Virginia's supermax prisons. Advocacy groups like the ACLU and Human Rights Watch called for reform. The Department of Corrections promised internal reviews. But inside Red Onion, the message was different. Word spread through the vents and walls, if they can kill him, they can kill any of us. Tension rose overnight. According to court documents from Hall v. Johnson, 2012, fellow inmates filed grievances claiming routine abuse, denial of medical care, and retaliation for speaking out. Many of those claims were later dismissed on procedural grounds, but the public record remains, a paper trail of pain and silence. The system of isolation. Every supermax prison is built on a philosophy: control equals safety. At Red Onion, that philosophy became ritual. Each morning, officers walk cell to cell, peering through slots, checking wrists, searching for contraband. There's no physical contact unless necessary. No direct conversation beyond commands. A former inmate later described in a 2016 PBS Frontline documentary how solitary erased his sense of time. He said, "After a few years, you stop talking to yourself. Then you stop thinking in words." His testimony was used in a 2019 lawsuit challenging Virginia's segregation policies, alleging violations of the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. According to those filings, inmates in solitary at Red Onion experienced severe psychological effects, hallucinations, paranoia, self-harm. Psychiatrists called it SHU syndrome, named after the segregated housing units in which prisoners spend years alone. The state's defense argued that solitary was essential to protect staff and other inmates. They cited dozens of assaults, gang threats, and attempted murders as evidence that Red Onion was working as intended. But outside the walls, a different picture was forming, one that questioned whether control had crossed into cruelty. The Code of the Guards. Most correctional officers at Red Onion are locals, men and women from Appalachian towns where coal jobs vanished and the prison became the only stable employer. Many have family members who also work inside. They call it the career that pays the bills and takes your sleep. According to a 2011 Virginian pilot report, officers receive extensive training in riot control, restraint techniques, and psychological defense. Still, turnover is high. The constant tension and mental strain create a culture of hypervigilance and loyalty, a thin gray line. Inside, silence is not just a rule, it's a shield. Officers rarely talk about incidents, even with their families. To break that silence is to break the code. One retired officer recalled in an anonymous affidavit filed in a 2015 civil rights case that some staff became numb to the environment. He wrote, "You stop seeing them as men and start seeing them as movement risks. That's how you get through the day." The pressure cooker. Every system under pressure eventually cracks. At Red Onion, cracks appear in moments that don't make the news. Inmates slam their doors in unison to protest conditions, a practice called clapping steel. Officers respond with mass searches and extraction teams. Each side plays its part in an unwritten script of power and resistance. Behind those walls, human beings fight not for freedom, but for a sense of existence. According to a 2018 report by the Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy, some reforms have been introduced: mental health units, step-down programs that allow inmates to earn time out of solitary through good behavior. Yet advocates argue progress is slow and reversible. Still, for men like Marcus H., hope comes in tiny moments: a letter from family, a glimpse of sky through the yard cage, the brief touch of sun on a hand that hasn't held another in years. A world cut off. Red Onion's design ensures that most people in Virginia will never see what goes on inside. No public tours. Limited media access. A thick layer of bureaucratic protection around its walls. The official line is simple. It's secure, it's controlled, and it keeps the public safe. But every few years, a leak slips through: a lawsuit, a letter, a recording. Each one peels back another layer of the onion and shows how thin the line between order and oppression can be. For the men locked inside, the fight is no longer against each other, it's against the slow erosion of self. And for the guards outside their cells, the battle is just as quiet, holding a system together that everyone knows is slowly breaking apart. The gang blueprint: power through isolation. They say gangs die in lockdown. At Red Onion, they adapted. When every word is monitored and every gesture punished, control stops being physical, it becomes psychological. A new order. The late 1990s and early 2000s brought an unexpected shift. Virginia officials believed the Red Onion model, 23-hour confinement, zero group movement, would dissolve prison gangs. Instead, according to the 2004 Virginia Corrections Intelligence Report, isolation reorganized loyalty. Without turf or weapons, leadership became invisible, coded messages, legal mail, and whispered orders passed through vents. An investigator quoted in the Virginian Pilot described it as a distributed command system. They learned to run empires blind. From solitary, reputed gang leaders allegedly mapped rivalries across the East Coast, using relatives or corrupt intermediaries to relay instructions. It wasn't chaos, it was structure reborn. Language of control. Inside Red Onion, communication was currency. Officers learned to decode vent talk. A single cough might mean guard coming. 3 taps could mark allegiance. The wrong pattern could get a man beaten the next time the slot opened for food. According to depositions filed in Banks v. Virginia DOC, 2011, inmates invented entire alphabets from tap codes, a fusion of Morse, Spanish street slang, and military cadence. Investigators found folded paper kites no larger than a thumbprint carrying detailed hierarchies: generals, sergeants, soldiers. One kite seized during a search read, "Loyalty survives walls." It wasn't bravado, it was doctrine. The Red Cell Brotherhood. Among the earliest organized bodies was a group officials nicknamed the Red Cell Brotherhood. It wasn't one gang but a temporary alliance of rivals, bloods, disciples, and independent inmates, formed after Darrell Hall's death. According to a 2009 internal incident log obtained by Richmond Times-Dispatch, members coordinated hunger strikes and refused yard time for weeks, demanding external investigations. The DOC's response was swift: mass cell searches, confiscations, disciplinary write-ups. But the protest achieved something unexpected: it forged communication between cells that had never spoken. Isolation had welded unity. Years later, reform advocates would cite the Red Cell protests as proof that even under extreme control, the human need for voice cannot be extinguished. Guards on the edge. For correctional officers, this invisible chess game was constant. A 2013 training memo leaked to The Intercept warned staff, assume every silence hides coordination. Rookies were told never to underestimate dead time, the quiet between movements when messages move fastest. A veteran officer, speaking anonymously to Vice News, described how fatigue blurred moral lines. You start treating everyone as the same threat. Then one day you realize you've become part of the machine they fear. According to union filings, staff assaults rose by 20% between 2007 and 2012. To officers, that justified more control; to critics, it proved the system was breaking. Surveillance state behind bars. By 2010, Red Onion had evolved into one of the most surveilled environments in America. Hundreds of cameras, infrared sensors, and motion alarms monitored every corridor. Inmates joked that even their shadows were on payroll. Yet surveillance bred ingenuity. Gang members learned to exploit blind spots, literally and bureaucratically. If the cameras couldn't hear, the paperwork could. False grievances, duplicate mail forms, or coded legal citations became tools of misdirection. One investigator later testified in U.S. v. Jeffries, 2015, that gang leaders used legal mail to ship intelligence between facilities under attorney-client privilege. When authorities caught on, rules tightened further, deepening resentment among inmates who relied on the system for genuine appeals. The economy of power. Even in total lockdown, currency flows. At Red Onion, everything, stamps, ramen, painkillers, had value. Control of that microeconomy meant power. According to a 2017 DOC audit, contraband routes often began with outside staff or contracted workers. A pack of tobacco worth $7 outside could sell for $150 in cell. For gangs, controlling supply meant loyalty. A former inmate told PBS Frontline that, "You don't need to see your crew to run business. You just need one corrupt hand." Authorities launched sting operations, firing several staff and introducing body scanners, but smuggling adapted faster than policy. Power in Red Onion wasn't about violence, it was about access. The psychology of loyalty. Why risk everything for a gang you can't even meet? Psychologists studying Red Onion in 2018 found a pattern: inmates craved identity more than safety. After years of sensory deprivation, belonging, even to a violent tribe, offered coherence. Dr. Shannon Green of the University of Virginia described it as identity preservation through affiliation. Her report cited interviews where inmates referred to their gang not as a group but as family by code. That mindset made traditional rehabilitation nearly impossible. Officials tried step-down programs, rewarding good behavior with gradual privileges, but success rates were uneven. One warden admitted in a 2019 hearing, "You can't deprogram survival." The Invisible War. The next decade turned Red Onion into a case study for global observers. European human rights commissions visited in 2016 and 2019, comparing U.S. supermax conditions to prolonged psychological torture under international law. The DOC disputed those findings, emphasizing safety statistics and reductions in inmate on-staff violence. But the numbers told a divided story. Violence dropped inside the walls, yet lawsuits and mental health crises soared. Every layer of control revealed a new layer of damage. A classified internal memo from 2020, later cited in state hearings, warned, if communication between inmates cannot be stopped, it must be redirected. Programs in art, writing, and mentorship were cautiously introduced, trying to channel leadership into structure. For some, it worked. For others, silence remained the loudest weapon. Legacy of Red Onion. Today, Red Onion stands as both warning and mirror. It shows how far a system will go to control violence, and how violence can evolve to fit any system. Its gangs proved that isolation breeds innovation. Its guards proved that order can consume empathy. And between them lies the question every society must face: how much control is too much? According to the 2023 Virginia DOC Review Panel, reforms continue, but advocacy groups insist transparency is minimal. Requests for bodycam footage, disciplinary records, and solitary statistics remain slow-released or heavily redacted. Some call it secrecy. Officials call it security. Either way, the world outside still sees only the outer layer, and the onion keeps its core. The war within, when guards and inmates collide. They call it the line, the invisible frontier that separates survival from surrender. At Red Onion, that line isn't painted on the floor. It's drawn in fear, pride, and silence. The tension before impact. Every morning, as the yard gates clank open and the steel doors unlock one by one, the officers of Red Onion walk into a tension thicker than the Appalachian fog. They wear stab-resistant vests and mirrored sunglasses, but the real armor is mental, a practiced calm forged by repetition. Keep your tone even, don't show emotion, don't take it personal. That's what the training manuals say. But Red Onion doesn't care about manuals. The inmates see everything: the twitch of a hand, the hesitation before a command, the fatigue in an officer's eyes. And the officers see patterns: the pause before compliance, the faint smirk that signals challenge, the sudden quiet that means something's about to go wrong. This is how Red Onion breathes, through anticipation. When control turns personal. According to the 2014 Virginia DOC Internal Review on Use of Force Incidents, most altercations inside Red Onion begin with something small: a delayed meal tray, a missed shower, a sarcastic word. But small sparks in this environment are flares in a powder room. One officer, identified in reports only as C.O. Adams, described an incident that began over a broken light fixture. An inmate refused to cuff up for maintenance. Words escalated. Pepper spray filled the cell. Minutes later, backup stormed in, 5 officers in black armor known as the extraction team. Everything was recorded, as policy requires. What wasn't captured was the look that passed between the inmate and Adams, years of resentment compressed into one stare. That's the hidden side of Red Onion, conflict so personal it becomes institutional. According to court filings in Adams v. Clark, 2015, the inmate later filed a grievance claiming excessive force. The DOC cleared staff after review. Both men remained in the same facility. Neither forgot the weight of duty. Working at Red Onion is not just a job, it's an identity. Officers call themselves keepers of chaos. Many come from mining families who lost work when coal collapsed. To them, the prison offered stability, a paycheck, insurance, pride. But stability has a price. A 2017 University of Richmond study on correctional burnout found that officers at Red Onion scored among the highest in the state for emotional desensitization. The report described a cycle of hardened empathy, where compassion becomes a liability. One guard, quoted anonymously, said, "You start thinking, if I don't harden up, I'll break. So you stop feeling. That's the only way to stay human here." It's a paradox that defines the facility. To survive emotionally, you must stop being emotional. Inmates under pressure. Inside the cells, inmates read that detachment as hostility. They interpret silence as contempt, and contempt as challenge. The system feeds the feedback loop. A 2020 Richmond Times-Dispatch expose revealed that disciplinary charges at Red Onion were disproportionately high for failure to obey, a vague infraction often tied to tone or perceived disrespect. Critics argue it reflects a culture of zero tolerance that punishes personality, not just behavior. One inmate wrote in a smuggled letter later published by a reform group, "Here, you don't need to fight to lose. You just need to speak wrong." Each write-up adds days, weeks, or months to solitary time. Every punishment chips away at sanity, and every breakdown reinforces the guard's belief that isolation is necessary. The system feeds itself. When silence breaks. But sometimes, something cracks. In 2012, Red Onion faced one of its most tense standoffs in years. According to official DOC incident logs, multiple inmates refused to return from recreation cages, demanding medical care for another prisoner allegedly injured during an extraction. Guards formed tactical lines. Beanbag rounds and pepper spray were authorized but not used after negotiations calmed the situation. The event never made national news, but internally, it changed policy. Afterward, the DOC quietly revised guidelines for emergency responses, requiring mental health staff presence during potential disturbances. Yet for those inside, it was proof that unity still existed, even in isolation. Mental collapse in uniform. While inmates suffer visibly, the staff's unraveling happens behind closed doors. The same 2017 Richmond study recorded alarming rates of PTSD symptoms among officers. Some refused counseling, fearing stigma. Others simply quit. A retired sergeant told the Washington Post in 2019, "We weren't trained to carry this weight. We were trained to contain it." He described dreams of cell doors slamming, alarms echoing at home, and phantom voices shouting commands. The prison followed him everywhere. He left after 15 years. Others stayed, not because they loved the job, but because there was nowhere else to go. In small Appalachian towns, Red Onion isn't just the main employer, it's the backbone of survival. To leave it is to leave your community. The inmate's eyes. One inmate, in correspondence with advocacy group Solitary Watch, wrote something that encapsulated the prison's paradox. "We live behind glass, but they're trapped with us. They just go home at night." That sentiment blurs the moral line. Who is truly imprisoned here? The officer who returns daily to the same gray halls, fighting the same battles? Or the inmate who never leaves, living under the same ceiling of light? Red Onion erases those boundaries until everyone becomes part of its architecture. Escalation. In 2015, according to DOC disciplinary records and federal filings, an incident in CPOD became the catalyst for a statewide review. A fight between two rival gang members escalated when guards intervened. Reports say one officer was stabbed in the leg with a sharpened toothbrush, another struck by a food tray. The response was overwhelming: full lockdown for weeks, yard time suspended, mail censored. To the administration, it was a necessary security measure. To the inmates, it was collective punishment. During interviews years later, one former guard admitted, "That day, we realized this place had a pulse. You think it's dead quiet, then it reminds you it's alive and angry." After that event, Red Onion introduced body-worn cameras and increased external oversight. But oversight doesn't heal trust, it only documents its absence. When systems turn sentient. Over time, institutions develop personalities. Red Onion's is suspicion. Every rule, every camera, every training session revolves around anticipating betrayal, from inmates, from staff, from the system itself. Even outside auditors have described an institutional echo chamber where problems feed policy instead of reform. A 2021 Human Rights Watch summary noted that the prison's architecture magnifies paranoia. Guards stand in bulletproof booths above pods, looking down through glass at inmates they never touch. The power dynamic is literal, height versus confinement. Over years, both sides forget what normal interaction feels like. When that happens, even kindness becomes dangerous. The cost of control. By 2022, Red Onion's budget exceeded $36 million annually, much of it spent on staffing and security upgrades. Critics argue that money reinforces isolation rather than rehabilitation. The DOC counters that every dollar prevents bloodshed. But in practice, the line between prevention and provocation is thin. Each new restriction sparks new defiance, each act of defiance justifies the next restriction. It's a system that sustains itself by feeding on tension. A self-contained ecosystem of distrust. Echoes of reform. There are attempts to change it. The step-down program, introduced in 2013 and refined through 2019, lets inmates earn privileges through positive behavior, a chance to transition from solitary back to general population. According to DOC data, hundreds have completed it successfully. Yet former participants told The Intercept that progress feels conditional. They tell you to change, but the system doesn't. Still, hope exists, quiet, cautious hope. In letters smuggled through advocacy groups, inmates describe small victories. A radio allowed back. A window shade lifted. A conversation with a counselor that felt real. Tiny things, but inside Red Onion, tiny things mean survival. The line blurs. As years pass, the old narratives fade, the idea of guards as villains and inmates as monsters. What remains are people caught in a system built to never forget and rarely forgive. A counselor once told a journalist during a 2020 DOC tour. Everyone here is just trying not to disappear. And that might be Red Onion's greatest secret, not its violence or its gangs, but its power to erase identity, one day at a time. Voices beneath the concrete, redemption or ruin. If you stand outside Red Onion on a quiet morning, you can hear the wind cut through the razor wire. But listen closer, and you'll realize it's not the wind at all, it's the sound of men talking to themselves, whispering to concrete walls that never answer back. For some, that silence is punishment. For others, it's the beginning of something deeper, the long, slow confrontation with their own ghosts. The longest sentence. Time moves differently inside Red Onion. There are no clocks in most cells, no calendars except those drawn in pencil on gray cinderblock walls. The only constant is the fluorescent hum, the sound of artificial daylight, 24 hours a day. Inmates have described losing track of seasons, years, even the shape of their own faces. In a 2018 solitary watch correspondence, one man wrote, "I forgot what I looked like. Then I stopped caring. That's when I realized what this place does, it doesn't kill you fast. It erases you. But not everyone disappears. Some fight back, not with violence, but with memory. They write letters, poems, lawsuits. They turn isolation into testimony." One such voice came from inmate K. Morris, composite name, who spent nearly a decade in segregation. In 2016, his writings were published anonymously in a prison newsletter, We Are the Unheard, Buried in Light. Yet even under concrete, voices grow. Months later, his essay reached lawmakers reviewing the state's solitary confinement practices. It didn't change the system overnight, but it made it harder to ignore. A shift in the wind. After years of mounting criticism, something began to stir beyond the walls. In 2019, Virginia's Department of Corrections announced a new, step-down reentry initiative, supported by mental health professionals, clergy, and former inmates. It wasn't a revolution, it was a recalibration. Instead of punishment, the program emphasized progression. Officers were trained to use de-escalation over domination. Therapists were added to daily rounds. Some cells were modified for group therapy, their steel doors replaced with perforated panels that allowed sound and sight, fragile bridges of human contact. A 2022 report from the Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy noted measurable changes, self-harm incidents dropped by 30%, and assaults on staff declined. But even officials admitted, culture shifts slower than policy. For many officers, compassion still felt like weakness. For many inmates, trust still felt like bait. The human experiment. Red Onion, for all its concrete and control, became an accidental laboratory for one of America's hardest questions: can a system built on fear ever learn empathy? Psychologists studying the facility described a paradox. Solitary confinement, once intended to break gang communication, instead created introspection in a few, and madness in others. Some rediscovered faith. Others lost it completely. An anonymous chaplain, quoted in a 2021 Washington Post feature, said, "I've seen men write their way out of darkness, and others drown in it. The same silence that heals one destroys another. That unpredictability makes Red Onion a moral maze. How do you reform a place where punishment and therapy share the same hallway? The outside world looks in." For years, media requests to film inside Red Onion were denied. Then, in 2016, a limited-access PBS Frontline crew was allowed partial entry. Their footage showed empty corridors, solitary cells, and interviews with both officers and inmates. One guard summed it up bluntly. "We don't run a prison. We run a volcano. You just hope it doesn't erupt on your shift." That documentary sparked renewed debate about solitary confinement nationwide. Civil rights advocates called for closure of all long-term isolation units. State officials defended their necessity. Both sides used Red Onion as evidence, proof that either reform works or that control must remain absolute. The truth, as always, lives somewhere in the middle. Rehabilitation or reaction. In 2021, new leadership at the Virginia DOC launched a pilot program pairing select Red Onion inmates with counselors from Virginia Tech's Correctional Psychology Department. The initiative's goal was simple: to measure whether long-term isolation could be reversed through intensive dialogue. The results, declassified in 2023, were mixed. Some participants improved, showing reduced aggression and fewer infractions. Others withdrew further, distrusting what they called state-sponsored empathy. One inmate told researchers, "You don't undo 15 years of silence with one conversation. You learn to smile for the camera, then you go back to your box." Still, researchers concluded the experiment was cautiously promising. Even a crack of light, they said, mattered. The cost no one sees. While public attention focuses on inmates, Red Onion's invisible toll is its staff. Behind every extraction, every lockdown, are human beings absorbing trauma in silence. A 2020 occupational health review found correctional officers in supermax facilities had depression rates triple that of police officers. Many turned to alcohol or isolation themselves, a quiet reflection of the very system they enforce. Retired Officer Brian C., pseudonym, described it best in his testimony to a state reform panel. "We're told to be unbreakable, but no one asks what it costs to stay that way." He paused, then added softly, "The walls don't just hold them. They hold us too." The echo of redemption. In recent years, letters from Red Onion have begun surfacing online, not threats or complaints, but reflections. Men writing about regret, religion, and the search for purpose after violence. Some join faith programs. Others mentor younger inmates through the bars. A few have even been released and now speak publicly about the experience. One former prisoner, Jason Robinson, name public, cited by The Guardian in 2022, described stepping outside after 15 years of near-total isolation. "I froze when I felt wind. Real wind. Not recycled air. I cried, then laughed, then got scared, because I didn't know how to walk without walls." He now advocates for prison mental health awareness. His story, like many, reminds the world that survival inside Red Onion doesn't end at the gate, it continues long after freedom. The concrete remembers. Every prison has its ghosts. Red Onion has thousands, men who came in violent, broken, or forgotten, and whose memories are trapped within those pale gray walls. Ask any longtime guard, and they'll tell you the building itself feels alive, humming at night, clicking under the pressure of the mountain wind. Maybe it's just concrete settling. Or maybe it's the sound of what's left behind. One officer who retired after 20 years left a single note in his locker, later found by new recruits. It read, "Never mistake silence for peace. This place keeps what it takes." No one knows who wrote it. But everyone understands it. The unanswered question. As of 2025, Red Onion State Prison remains operational, its population hovering near 800 inmates. Reform continues, lawsuits continue, and the public debate rages on. Officials say it's safer than ever. Advocates say safety without humanity is just another kind of violence. And somewhere in between those arguments, buried under the paperwork, the politics, and the silence, are the people who live it. The men who guard it. The men who survive it. And the ghosts of both. Because at Red Onion, redemption isn't guaranteed. But neither is ruin. It's a constant fight between the two, echoing through the walls, long after the doors close for the night. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. White heavy checkmark sourcing and references. PBS Frontline, Solitary Nation, 2016, limited footage from Virginia DOC. Virginia DOC Step-Down and Reentry Initiative Reports, 2019 to 2023. Washington Post and The Guardian Feature Interviews, 2020 to 2022. Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy Reform Report, 2022. Occupational Health Review, Correctional Officer Stress Index, 2020. Solitary Watch Archives, 2015 to 2023.